Chapter 25. Music's Lofty Peaks. The Buddha had travelled the road from Varanasi to Rajgaha before. He walked slowly and enjoyed the surrounding forests and rice fields. Towards noon, he stopped to beg in a small hamlet by the roadside. He then entered the forest to eat quietly and did walking meditation right there. When he had finished, he sat beneath a shady tree to meditate. He enjoyed being alone in the forest. After he had meditated for some hours, a group of well-dressed young men passed by, obviously agitated over something. Several of them clutched musical instruments. The young man at the head of their party bowed his head to greet the Buddha and then asked, "Monk, did you see a girl run by here?" The Buddha asked, "Why do you wish to find her?" The young man recounted their story from the beginning. They were from the city of Varanasi and had entered the forest that morning on a pleasure outing, bringing with them their musical instruments and a young woman to entertain them. When they had finished singing, dancing, and feasting, they stretched out on the forest floor to take a nap. But when they awoke, they discovered that the young girl had stolen their jewelry and disappeared. They had been chasing after her ever since. The Buddha looked calmly at the young men and asked, "Tell me, friends, is it better in this moment to find the young woman or to find your own selves?" The young men were startled. The Buddha's radiant appearance and his unusual question brought them back to themselves. The first young man answered, "Respected teacher, perhaps we should try and find ourselves first." The Buddha said, "Life can be found only in the present moment, but our minds rarely dwell in the present moment. Instead, we chase after the past or long for the future. We think we are being ourselves, but in fact we almost never are in real contact with ourselves. Our minds are too busy chasing after yesterday's memories or tomorrow's dreams. The only way to be in touch with life is to return to the present moment. Once you know how to return to the present moment, you will become awakened, and at that moment you will find your true self. Look at these tender leaves caressed by the sunlight. Have you ever really looked at the green of the leaves with a serene and awakened heart? This shade of green is one of the wonders of life. If you have never really looked at it, please do so now." The young men grew very quiet. With their eyes following the Buddha's pointing finger, each of them looked at the green leaves gently swaying in the afternoon breeze. A moment later, the Buddha turned to the young youth sitting on his right and said, "I see you have a flute. Please play something for us." The youth felt shy, but he lifted his flute to his lips and began to play. Everyone listened attentively. The flute's sound was like the lamenting cry of a disappointed lover. The Buddha's eyes did not waver from the young man playing the flute. When he finished his song, sadness seemed to veil the afternoon forest. Still no one spoke, until suddenly the young man held out his flute to the Buddha and said, "Respected monk, please play for us." The Buddha smiled, as several of the young men burst out laughing, taking their friend for a real fool. Who ever heard of a monk playing the flute? But to their surprise, the Buddha took the flute in his hands. The young men all turned their eyes to the Buddha, unable to mask their curiosity. The Buddha took several deep breaths and then raised the flute to his lips. The image of a young man playing the flute long ago in the royal gardens of Kapilavatthu arose in the Buddha's mind. It was a full moon night. He could see Mahapajapati sitting on a stone bench, quietly listening. And there was Yasodhara with her freshly lit incense holder of fragrant sandalwood. The Buddha began to play the flute. The sound was as delicate as a thin strand of smoke curling gently from the roof of a simple dwelling outside Kapilavatthu at the hour of the evening meal. Slowly, the thin strand expanded across space like a gathering of clouds, which in turn transformed into 1,000-petaled lotus, each petal a different shimmering colour. It seemed that one flautist suddenly had become 10,000 flautists, and all the wonders of the universe had been transformed into sounds. Sounds of 1,000 colours and forms, sounds as light as a breeze and quick as the pattering of rain, clear as a crane flying overhead, intimate as a lullaby, bright as a shining jewel, and subtle as the smile of one who has transcended all thoughts of gain and loss. The birds of the forest stopped singing in order to listen to this sublime music, and even the breezes ceased rustling the leaves. The forest was enveloped in an atmosphere of total peace, serenity, and wonder. The young men sitting around the Buddha felt completely refreshed, and they now dwelled completely in the present moment, in touch with all the wonders of the trees, the Buddha, the flute, and each other's friendship. Even after the Buddha put the flute down, they could still hear the music. Not one of the young men thought about the young woman or the jewels she had stolen. No one spoke for a long while. Then the young man to whom the flute belonged asked the Buddha, "Master, you play so wonderfully. I've never heard anyone who could play so well. Who did you study with? Would you accept me as your student so that I could learn the flute from you?" The Buddha smiled and said, "I learned to play the flute when I was a boy, but I have not played in nearly 7 years. My sound, however, is better than it was before." "How can that be, Master? How can your playing have improved if you've not practiced in 7 years?" Playing the flute does not depend solely on practicing the flute. I now play better than in the past because I have found my true self. You cannot reach lofty heights in art if you do not first discover the unsurpassable beauty in your own heart. If you would like to play the flute truly well, you must find your true self on the path of awakening. The Buddha explained the path of liberation, the 4 noble truths, and the noble eightfold path. The young men listened intently, and when the Buddha was finished speaking, every one of them knelt down and asked to be accepted as a disciple. The Buddha ordained them all. He then instructed them to make their way to Isipatana and introduce themselves to the bhikkhu, Kundana, who would give them guidance in the practice of the way. The Buddha told them he would see them again before long. That night, the Buddha slept alone in the forest. The next morning, he crossed the Ganga and headed east. He wanted to visit the children of Uruvela before making his way to Rajgaha to see King Bimbisara. Chapter 26. Water Rises Too. 7 days later, the Buddha was happy to find himself back in the forest of the Bodhi tree. He rested the night there. In the morning, he surprised Svasti by the banks of the Naranjara river. They sat for a long while along the shore before the Buddha told Vasti he should continue cutting the kusa grass needed by the buffaloes. He also helped Svasti cut some grass. Then, bidding Svasti goodbye, he walked to the village to beg. The next afternoon, the village children came to visit the Buddha in the forest. All of Svasti's family was there. Sujata brought her friends. The children were very happy to see the Buddha again. They listened intently while he told them all that had happened to him in the past year. The Buddha promised Svasti that when Svasti was 20 years old, the Buddha would accept him as a bhikkhu. By that time, Svasti's sister and brother would be old enough to care for themselves. The children told the Buddha that over the past few months, a spiritual community led by a Brahmin had settled nearby. There were 500 devotees in all. They did not shave their heads like the bhikkhus. Instead, their hair was braided and then piled on top of their heads. They worshipped the god of fire. The Brahmin's name was Kassapa. He was deeply revered by all who met him. The following morning, the Buddha crossed the river and found Master Kassapa's community. His devotees lived in simple huts made from leafy branches and wore clothes made from the bark of trees. They did not enter the village to beg, but accepted offerings brought to them by the villagers. In addition, they raised their own animals for food and for making sacrifices. The Buddha stopped to speak to one of Kassapa's followers, who told him that Kassapa was deeply versed in the Vedas and lived a life of utmost virtue. Kassapa, he explained, also had 2 younger brothers who also led communities of fire worship. All 3 brothers held fire to be the original essence of the universe. Uruvela Kassapa was deeply loved by his 2 brothers, Nadi Kassapa, who lived with 300 devotees along the Naranjara, about a day's travel north, and Gaya Kassapa, who led 200 devotees in Gaya. Kassapa's disciple led the Buddha to his master's hut, so that the Buddha could have an audience with him. Although Kassapa was no longer a young man, he was still quick and alert. When he saw the young teacher's extraordinary bearing, he felt immediately drawn to him and treated him as a special guest. Kassapa invited the Buddha to sit on a stump outside the hut, and the 2 enjoyed a long conversation. Kassapa marveled at how deeply versed the Buddha was in the Vedas. He was further astounded to discover that this young man had grasped certain concepts in the Vedas which had eluded his own understanding. The Buddha helped explain certain of the most profound passages in the Tathaveda and the Rigveda scriptures, which Kassapa thought he had understood, but discovered he had not yet truly grasped. Even more amazing was the young monk's knowledge of history, doctrine, and Brahmanic rituals. That noon, the Buddha accepted Uruvela Kassapa's invitation to have a meal with him. The Buddha neatly folded his outer robe into a cushion and sat upon it, eating in mindful silence. So impressed was Uruvela Kassapa by the Buddha's serene and majestic countenance that he did not break the silence. That afternoon they continued their conversation. The Buddha asked, "Master Kassapa, Can you explain to me how worshipping fire can lead a person to liberation? Revealer Kassapa did not answer right away. He knew very well that a superficial or ordinary response would not suffice for the extraordinary young monk. Kassapa began by explaining that fire was the basic essence of the universe. It had its source in Brahma. The main altar of the community, the fire sanctuary, always kept a sacred fire burning. That fire was itself the image of Brahma. The Ataveda scripture spoke of fire worship. Fire was life. Without fire, there could be no life. Fire was light, warmth, and the source of the sun, which enabled plants, animals, and people to live. It chased away dark shadows, conquered the cold, and brought joy and vitality to all beings. Food was made edible by fire, and thanks to fire, people were reunited with Brahma at death. Because fire was the source of life, it was Brahma himself. Agni, the god of fire, was one of the thousands of manifestations of Brahma. On the fire altar, Agni was portrayed as having two heads. One symbolized the daily uses of fire, and the other symbolized the fire of sacrifice and returning to the source of life. The fire worshippers performed 40 sacrificial rites. A devotee in their community had to observe precepts, practice austerities, and pray diligently in order to follow the path that would one day lead to liberation. Kassapa was strongly opposed to those Brahmins who used their position in society to acquire wealth and lose themselves in the pursuit of sensual pleasures. He said that such Brahmins only performed rituals and recited the scriptures in order to become rich. Because of that reputation of the traditional Brahmanic path, it had become tarnished. The Buddha asked, Master Kassapa, what do you think of those who regard water as the fundamental essence of life, who say that water is the element which purifies and returns people to union with Brahma? Kassapa hesitated. He thought of the hundreds of thousands of people, right at that very moment, who were bathing themselves in the water of Ganga and other sacred rivers to purify themselves. Gautama, water cannot really help one attain liberation. Water naturally flows down. Only fire rises. When we die, our body rises in smoke, thanks to fire. Master Kassapa, that is not accurate. The white clouds floating above are also a form of water. Thus, water rises too. Indeed, smoke itself is no more than evaporated water. Both clouds and smoke will eventually return to a liquid state. All things, as I'm sure you know, move in cycles. But all things share one fundamental essence, and all things return to that one essence. Master Kassapa, all things depend on all other things for their existence. Take, for example, this leaf in my hand. Earth, water, heat, seed, tree, clouds, sun, time, space. All these elements have enabled this leaf to come into existence. If just one of these elements was missing, the leaf could not exist. All beings, organic and inorganic, rely on the law of dependent co-arising. The source of one thing is all things. Please consider this carefully. Don't you see that this leaf I am now holding in my hand is only here thanks to the interpenetration of all the phenomena in the universe, including your own awareness? It was already evening and beginning to grow dark. Kassapa invited the Buddha to sleep in his own hut. It was the first time he had ever made such an offer to anyone, but then he had never before met such an extraordinary monk. But the Buddha refused, saying he had grown accustomed to sleeping alone at night. He said he would like to sleep in the fire sanctuary, if that would be okay. The Brahmin said, "For the past several days, an enormous snake has taken refuge in the fire sanctuary. All efforts to chase it away have failed. You must not sleep there, friend Gautama. It might be dangerous. We have even been holding our ceremonies outside for fear of the snake. Please, sleep in my hut for your own safety." The Buddha replied, "Don't worry. I want to sleep in the fire sanctuary. I will not be in any danger." The Buddha recalled all the months he had practiced austerities in the wild jungle. Wild beasts passed him by without harming him. Sometimes, while he sat in meditation, enormous snakes slithered in front of him. He knew that if you took care not to frighten such animals, they would not harm you. Seeing that the Buddha could not be dissuaded, Kassapa said, "If you wish to sleep in the fire sanctuary, you shall. You may sleep there as many nights as you wish." That night, the Buddha entered the fire sanctuary. On the central altar burned a great fire fed by many candles. On one side of the room was a pile of sandalwood logs, which were used for outdoor ceremonies. The Buddha guessed that the snake was probably curled up in the woodpile, so he sat in meditation on the other side of the room, using his folded robe as a cushion. He meditated deep into the night. Towards the end of his meditation, he saw the great snake coiled in the center of the room, looking at him. The Buddha spoke softly to it. "Dear friend, return to the jungle for your own safety." The Buddha's voice was filled with love and understanding. The snake slowly uncoiled itself and crept out of the door. The Buddha stretched out and fell asleep. When he awoke, brilliant moonlight poured through the window onto his sleeping place. The 18th day moon was unusually bright. He thought how pleasant it would be to do walking meditation beneath its light. He shook off the dust from his outer robe and put it on, before walking out of the fire sanctuary. In the early hours of the morning, the sanctuary somehow caught on fire. Those who saw it first shouted to all the others. Everyone filled buckets of water from the river's edge, but to no avail. The water came too late to extinguish the raging fire. At last, the 500 devotees could do no more than stand and watch their sanctuary burn to the ground. Uruvela Kassapa stood with his followers. His heart was heavy with grief as he thought of the virtuous and talented young monk he had met only the day before. The young monk had surely perished in the fire. If only Gautama had consented to sleep in his hut, he would still be alive. Just as he was thinking this, the Buddha appeared. The Buddha had seen the fire from where he had been walking in the hills, and he had returned to see if he could be of any assistance. Overcome with relief and joy, Kassapa ran to the Buddha and grasped his hand. Thank goodness you are alive, friend Gautama. Nothing has happened to you. I am so happy. The Buddha placed his hands on the Brahman's shoulders and smiled. Thank you, my friend. Yes, I am all right. The Buddha knew that on the day Uruvela Kassapa would give a discourse, and that in addition to his own 500 disciples, at least 1,000 others would attend from the neighbouring villages that very day. The lecture would take place after the noonday meal. Sensing that his presence during the lecture might cause Kassapa some discomfort, the Buddha went begging down in the village. After receiving food offerings, he walked to the lotus pond, ate his meal there, and spent the entire afternoon at that very pleasant place. Late in the afternoon, Kassapa came looking for him. When he found him by the pond, he said, "Friend Gautama, we waited for you at the noon meal, but you never appeared. Why didn't you join us?" The Buddha responded that he had wished to be absent during the lecture. "Why did you not wish to attend the lecture?" asked Uruvela Kassapa. The Buddha only smiled gently. The Brahmin did not say anything else. He knew that the young monk had read his thoughts. How tactful and considerate Gautama was. They sat by the lotus pond and conversed. Kassapa said, "Yesterday you said that the presence of a leaf resulted from the coming together of many different conditions. You said that humans too exist only because of the coming together of many other conditions. But when all these conditions cease to be, where does the self go?" The Buddha answered, "For a long time, humans have been trapped by the concept of Atman, the concept of separate and eternal self. We have believed that when our body dies, this self continues to exist and seeks union with its source, which is Brahma. But friend Kassapa, this is a fundamental misunderstanding which has caused countless generations to go astray. You should know, friend Kassapa, that all things exist because of interdependence, and all things cease to be because of interdependence. This is because that is. This is not because that is not. This is born because that is born. This dies because that dies. This is the wonderful law of dependent co-arising, which I have discovered in my meditation. In truth, there is nothing which is separate and eternal. There is no self, whether a higher or a lower self. Kassapa, have you ever meditated on your body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations and consciousness? A person is made up of these 5 aggregates. They are continuously changing rivers in which one cannot find even one permanent element." Uruvela Kassapa remained silent for a long moment. Then he asked, "Could one say then that you teach the doctrine of non-being?" The Buddha smiled and shook his head. "No. The concept of non-being is one narrow view among a whole forest of narrow views. The concept of non-being is just as false as the concept of a separate, permanent self. Kassapa, look at the surface of this lotus pond. I do not say that the water and lotus do not exist. I only say that the water and the lotus arise thanks to the presence and interpenetration of all other elements, none of which are separate or permanent. Kassapa lifted his head and looked into the Buddha's eyes. If there is no self, no Atman, why should one practice a spiritual path in order to attain liberation? Who will be liberated? The Buddha looked deeply into the eyes of his Brahmana friend. His gaze was as radiant as the sun and as gentle as the soft moonlight. He smiled and said, "Kassapa, look for the answer within yourself." They returned together to Kassapa's community. Uruvela Kassapa insisted on giving the Buddha his hut for the night and went to sleep himself in the hut of one of his senior disciples. The Buddha could see how deeply Kassapa's disciples revered their teacher.